Welcome to the Digital Agency Growth Podcast. I'm your host, Dan Englander. Jeff, great to have you on the show.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, likewise. So we've been working together for a little while, and I've heard about Questus for a while, and you guys are doing really compelling work, but I didn't know a lot about your background, and I got a chance to kind of dig into your book, Exponential, Transform Your Brand by Empowering Instead of Interrupting, and there's so much to get into there. Before we cover anything like that, you've are a rare breed because you've had an agency, it looks like, for like 20 plus years, it sounds like, since 1998. Can you get into your background a little bit, like the origin story, if that's, and feel free to take as long or as little as you need to, and what it was like starting an agency back then?
Oh, wow. I mean, that origin story, I could pick it up at where we started the agency, or I could pick it up when I was born. But since you're giving me the mic and in a little bit of time, I'll take it all the way from before I was born. I'll take it back to the sperm and the egg, man, because I honestly feel like I was bred to work in advertising. My father was a lifelong salesman, just sold lighting fixtures. He was the son of a gangster, and he just wanted the first square job that he could find and stop living that sort of gangster lifestyle. So he was a sales guy. My mom was a shrink. So you think about that combination where my mom was always trying to figure out, what makes the human psyche tick, and my father was always trying to figure out how to leverage it. And then my grandfather, the gangster, was a rum runner. And if you look at the history of advertising, there's no shortage of alcohol flowing. So, I think all of that DNA fed into it, in all of which to say, like, I'm not a Harvard guy. I'm not a Yale guy. I'm not a genius by any stretch of the imagination. I barely graduated high school. I barely graduated college, but I found myself in the right place at the right time. And I was working for a small handful of Harvard Business School guys who were conducting market research. They didn't want to hire me. I begged my way in. I gave them a note at like 6 a.m. every day till the point where they were like, dude, just come on for an internship and we'll see how it goes. And what we were doing is collecting a bunch of marketing research data. What makes people tick, what makes people watch ads, what makes people read magazines. And what happened was the internet came along. I was actually in charge of connecting us to the internet. My short attention span got in the way. I couldn't even figure it out. My boss had to come in and save me, but eventually we were online when nobody else was. And I realized that industry was about to get completely disrupted. And I realized that every industry was about to get completely disrupted. And I went into my boss and I was like, look, Harvard Business School guy, I'm the dude with a 2.8 GPA from UVM. And I'm here to tell you, you're fucked, dude. Like, we have to change this business model. He was cool enough to give me the green light. Make a long story short, fast forward only a couple months. I've got Microsoft, Netscape, Sun Microsystems, Walt Disney, Levi Strauss, Discover Channel, all as my clients, because I was one of the only people in the entire country who understood how to collect data via the internet. But what was fascinating is they didn't just want data via the internet. Their big question was, what is the internet going to do to my business? And what is the implications for the internet in the way I grow my brand and the way I build advertisements? And quickly I realized that it was going to change every industry down to its core. People are looking for utility. They're looking for information. They're looking for valuable information. They're looking for something that's meaningful, not just your typical interruptions and frivolous messages. At the same time, my business partner was a world-class designer. He had art gallery openings, like you'd open People magazine, and there's like a picture of Johnny Depp with one of his paintings up on his wall. Like, that's how successful he was. But he realized he didn't want to sit around in art galleries smoking Marlboros, hoping to crack it into the big time. There's so much luck in that business. So he got into digital design. He showed me some stuff. It was absolutely beautiful, but it didn't function. And basically what we decided is we could take my nerdy background in his data, his really cool background in art and design, and blend those two together. And we were two dudes who had literally never stepped foot in an advertising agency. But what we realized is, at our core, is we can make much better ads than anything that we were seeing out there, simply by redefining what advertising is all about. So we started with, this is literally how we started: 2 desks, 1 chair, in 1 working computer. Like, we literally had to take turns sharing our 1 chair because we couldn't afford it. But within almost no time, we started scoring big brands. So at this point, we've worked with Apple, Amazon, American Express, Capital One, Bloomberg, Disney, ESPN, and I'm going in alphabetical order. I only got to E. So we feels like we've worked with literally dozens and dozens of the most influential brands in the world, quite simply because advertising is going through a revolution and people want to be empowered through advertisements. They don't want to just be interrupted through advertisements.
Yeah, that's there's so much to dig into there, and thanks for sharing that. What was it back in the day that let you kind of see that the internet was going to be disruptive? I mean, did the MBAs not see it? And if not, like what put you in a position to be right about something like that and to kind of like be have so much conviction around it?
Yeah, I think the advantage was honestly not being a great student, right? Like I've taken enough statewide tests to know my intelligence level is absolutely more than fine, but my attention span is so short. I can't sit still in a class. And I've figured you're the same, and so many of your listeners are the same if they're listening to this podcast, right? We're intelligent folks, but we're not built for sitting in a classroom. So if you go to Harvard or one of those top schools, and then maybe even after Harvard, you go to Procter and Gamble, and they've got brand school, and they teach you how to build billion-dollar brands, you're part of a system, and you've got really, really, really good at this system and these processes, which are fine, except for the fact that obviously the internet completely disrupted everything, and it was an advantage not to be inculcated into that factory of building traditional advertisements and have a fresh perspective, and which is as simple as, dude, nobody wants this shit anymore. Nobody wants TV ad interruptions. Nobody's going to be reading magazines anymore. If you try to take interruptions and port it onto the internet with a series of banner ads and pop-up ads, that's fine, but it's a hell of a lot less valuable than what we can be doing because the only limitation is our imagination. So really it was about having that fresh perspective.
Yeah, that makes sense. And let's dig into that a little bit. So back, around 98, two desks, one chair, that sort of atmosphere. Better Call Saul season one, trying to get the first clients. What did that look like? Like how did you win those initial clients, and what were you trying to accomplish back then, and kind of how has that mission changed, I guess, over time?
Man, it was bananas. I talked to my previous employers, those Harvard guys I talked about, Haldane King, Jacob Brown. They had a firm called King Brown and Partners. If they're listening to this, I love you guys. I appreciate you more than you could ever understand. I think about you literally every single day of my life. And they taught me not just about strategy, but about leadership and culture and building a team. I was totally locked in such a great situation. But they gave us a 3-month project, right? I was doing something internally. I was like, hey, I want to go start this thing. And they invested in us for 3 months to give them a very specific deliverable. And what we realized is we've got 3 months. We got 3 months to not only do a great job on this project, but we have to find our next lead. And the thing is, A, I didn't want to poach any of my previous clients. And B, I was a complete outsider. So I didn't have a Rolodex. I didn't even think through these things. And my short attention span kind of screwed us in that level. So like downstairs from where I worked, there was a coffee shop, Stan. And, his big claim to fame in my memory is one time I ordered a bagel, he burnt it and threw it out. And I was like, and then he paused, grabbed it out of the garbage, scraped the burnt part off and put cream cheese on it and gave it back to me. Okay, I'm a kid. Fuck it. I'll eat the bagel. But the funny thing is, you fast forward 6 weeks later and he's up in Jordan's apartment talking about this incredible international business that he's going to start. And we're like, holy shit, this is incredible. And at the end, we're like, what's your budget? He's like, I don't have a budget. How are you going to pay for it? I don't have any money. Like, we were kissing so many frogs. We had no idea what we were doing. Eventually, we met some good businesses. Eventually, we found an investor. He gave us some money for 4% of the company because this was the crazy Wild West days in the internet. Like, he gave us good money for 4% when didn't really have anything worth anything. But he gave us an office, and we started getting some meetings. And one of the stories that I talk about in my book, Exponential, this was probably the smartest move I ever did, although it is a touch scummy, which is we knew we needed social affirmation. So on a whiteboard, we wrote the names of 3 really big companies in 3 dates. And I remember which companies. It was Microsoft, and we put like 7/27. Then we put Nike, 6/24. Then we put Apple, and it was like 8/3. And we never said we were working with them. We never said we had meetings with them. But what I realized is when we sat down at the conference room table, people would look at me and Jordan and be like, oh, yeah, these guys know what they're talking about. We totally knew what we were talking about, but there was no social affirmation. Nobody wants to be the first big brand to jump on there. And I would watch their eyes go up over my shoulder, right? And I could see it trigger like, oh, Microsoft, Apple, right?
Mhm.
These are the guys that we're working with.
Yeah.
So eventually some companies, I can't even remember. I think it was Disney and ESPN were our very first big names. And then once we had one big name under our belt, all the others started coming on board because everything we were talking about was super fucking logical. Like, of course, people are looking for something meaningful. Of course, they want valuable content. Of course, they don't want to be interrupted when they're trying to watch their favorite TV show or football game. And eventually we learned, like, we weren't talking about psychological principles. We weren't putting terminology on it. But eventually we learn, like, that social affirmation is extraordinarily important. And we see it every single day. Ratings, reviews. I mean, nobody goes and buys a product without looking at ratings and reviews on Amazon nowadays, or if you're going to Airbnb or whatever, right? So those are the types of things that are so much more important than an interruption. They're so much more important than a 6 or a 15 or a 30-second spot. And the question is, can you create content? Can you create experiences that give people a great experience and drives those positive ratings and reviews?
Yeah, that's and by the way, that's super clever. I love that. Just it's so subtle, but it's so powerful. So with that, kind of like getting from, getting into these conversations and talking about the power of the internet back then, how has that shifted? Because it seems like you started the agency right before the big Web 2.0 crash. And in hindsight, it doesn't make sense that it kind of makes sense that all that stuff crashed because it was overly levered and things were early. But the ideas were mostly sound. Like if you think of like pets.com, it's like, okay, well, we got Chewy, we got Amazon, essentially the same sort of business. But back then, if you had all the cognitive bias of that thing being new in the early 2000s, you would have been like, oh yeah, of course, like who's going to buy pet food online, or who's going to let people stay in their home via Airbnb. So how did you deal with that? Like, how did you communicate the power of the internet back then versus how you talk about it now? Has it not changed that much, or have you had to kind of iterate on that a lot?
Our point of view is never vacillated. And, I think I've already mentioned it a couple times, and I'll keep repeating it over and over and over again until we're fully retired, which is people are looking for more from brand than interruptions and superficial messages. They're looking for brands to move people's lives forward one small step at a time. They're looking for brands to help solve their problems. And it really comes down to this. Everybody wakes up in the morning wanting one thing. They want to be better than they were the day before. It's at the heart of the human experience. It's what drives capitalism. So when brands seek to improve people's lives, when brands seek to empower people, they're literally drafting off of millions of years of evolution. Going back to the time of Web 2.0 and the crash, I think everybody got it. It was just too crazy back then. Like the valuations were too high. People were over investing in it. But almost all of those ideas have come to life. Your example of pets.com has come to life and through multiple brands and millions of dollars being sold via Amazon and in smaller brands and big brands. Like all of those ideas were valid. But I just think there was just too much money and too much insanity at the time. But the foundational principle of empowering people, of improving people's lives, that's what worked then. That's what works now. And that's what's going to work in perpetuity.
Yeah, that's great. And let's dig further into that, which is kind of the subject of your book, Exponential. Um, can you talk about that? Like, what does it mean for a brand to empower somebody versus interrupting them? And if you can, not to put you on the spot, but examples of, or an example of a brand doing this really well versus ones that have faltered at it, if any come to mind.
Yeah, sure. I mean, interruptions are so straightforward, and it's actually only half the equation. I think frivolous messages are the other half of it. So interruptions are what we see every day, right? You go to watch your favorite football game, you go to watch your favorite drama, you go to watch your favorite YouTube video, and you get interrupted with a 15-second spot, a 30-second spot. Sometimes it's a 60-second spot. Nobody wants those, right? Think about when you're just listening to a podcast, the most modern of media. And if it's ad supported, how quickly you go and hit that forward button. And, I think about the podcast I listen to, I know exactly how many times, right? I hit it 9 times in the beginning and it gets me to the content that I want because nobody wants those interruptions. Now, data proves those interruptions absolutely work. Like the whole world isn't insane. The issue is, as an industry in advertising, we're just asking those interruptions to do way too much, right? Technology has always been at the core of advertising. We think the internet is pretty profound, but think about TV, right? The whole world was so goddamn boring. And it was like, what, 70 years ago, everyone's huddled around the radio and all of a sudden there's sight, sound, and motion. And Ed Sullivan is sitting right there in your living room. That's a fucking incredible technological breakthrough. And guess what? Those ads were okay. It was like, all right, well, we haven't seen this before. We don't have the internet to do any research. So actually getting those products into our home via advertisements was actually kind of appealing until we just pushed it too far as an industry. We started using Fred and Barney and pushing cigarettes. And then people woke up with cancer and they're like, holy shit, brands can lie to us, right? Or, we had incredibly smart ideas in industry of creating soap operas so we could sell very specific CPGs. So all of a sudden it's like you're matching content to your audience, which was cool until there was just way too much of it. And, the cigarette thing aside, but even if brands are being honest and straightforward, there's just way too much of it. And then what we started doing is getting really frivolous with messages. So I think a more recent example that we can all relate to is the Budweiser "What's Up" campaign. What's up, right? When you and I were kids, that campaign came out and it changed the world. Like everyone was like calling their friends, "What's up? What's up?" And they sold like hotcakes. Like Budweiser was selling like hotcakes until they weren't, because everyone started jumping on and coming up with their own little iteration of some superficial or frivolous message. We continue to see it. If you watch sports, if you look at insurance ads, how annoying are those insurance ads? They're totally undifferentiated. They're all trying to be funny. Every now and then they're funny. And then you see the same one over and over and over again. I see that flow from Progressive ad over and over and over again. Guess what? It works, because if you look at how much those guys are spending, it's typically in the neighborhood of $1 billion in paid media. $1 billion just in paid media. So great. If you're Progressive or State Farm or Allstate, go for it, because you can get by with all of that muscle power. But there are so few companies that actually have that kind of budget. So you have to look towards something different. You have to empower people. You have to look at, what does that consumer journey look like? Not just awareness, interest, and conversion from aware to customer, but all the way to evangelist. Let's look at all those micro points along the way. Figure out what people are looking for. Identify their unmet needs, both emotionally and functionally, then create content that moves them down the funnel.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it seems like there's a lot of ways to do that. And it seems like it's harder than ever to go for a mass viral sort of approach now, unless you're one of those heavyweights, because there's just such fewer shared experiences. Like in the niche economy, there's both so many opportunities and limitations to do that. So how has that informed your thinking? Because it seems like on one hand, you're not necessarily going for like the mass frivolous message, but you are working with, it sounds like, the biggest companies on earth. So how do you balance that? So when they know, through the numbers that, okay, we can brute force this and it will work, how do you convince them otherwise? And what's kind of the better alternative for them?
Well, with some of these really big companies, the idea is to do both, right? If you're that big a company, you've got that big a budget, and most of our clients do, there is the power of brute force, right? There is the power of a great 30-second, or sometimes you might do like a micro documentary that's 3 or 4 minutes long, and you're putting a lot of emphasis into digital and social, or it might be the 30-second in TV. That's great. Like if you're a big company, do that, because you can, because you have the muscle, because you have the firepower, because you have the budgets. But you're asking it to do way too much. If you think you can go, hey, here's a great 30-second spot, and then later on Instagram, there's a little ad that says click here and buy now. You're missing the mathematical leverage in there. It may be effective, but it's not efficient. If you look at the car industry, and the best reason to look at the car industry is there's just so much data on it. What happens is, from the moment that someone says, I'm in the market, to the moment they say, I'm going to buy a car, it's 13 hours on average. Like some people are spending a lot more time, 13 hours. So think about, you're watching a ball game and you're going to buy a Toyota, and you see that Toyota ad like 10 times. First of all, the first time you're like, dude, that's cool. The second or third time, you're like, that's kind of cool. And then you just get annoyed. Like, are you kidding? It's the same ad over and over again. But let's just say all 10 times you're stoked. Like, oh, dude, I love that ad, right? That's a 13-hour journey. Now what that ad is now giving you is 3 minutes of content. There's now, 12 hours and 57 minutes left in that journey. And that's the opportunity for marketers to find leverage. Think about, in that example, if it's Toyota competing against Nissan, and one company is just taking like 10% of their budget away from the paid media and creating content all along the journey where there's leverage. Look what we're doing in social. Look what we're doing on our website. Look what we're doing on TikTok. Look how we're connecting it all when you actually go into the retail store to buy that car, right? There's all different opportunities to find leverage along that journey. And that's what's exciting about marketing, because if you go back to the earlier examples, early in my career, all of those CMOs, the people who were controlling the budget, they came from the, oh my God, I know how to make incredible 30-second spots. Now, the young folks, I was a young folk at that time, and we were the nerds. We're like, yeah, dude, creativity is awesome. We're not anti-creativity, but can we throw a bunch of math into this? Because if we throw a bunch of math into this, we can figure out how to provide value to the audience. Now, all of those people who were like 30 at the time, now they're in their 50s and they're the CMOs. They're the chief marketing officers. They're controlling the budgets. So if you're a CMO from the old way of thinking, whether it's a small brand or a big brand, and you think you're going to get by just on a great piece of creative, or to your point, something that goes viral on social, you're dead in the water, because somebody else is saying, I will take that creativity and I will superpower it with data and analytics to understand where those leverage points are in the journey.
Yeah, I love that. And this is kind of digging into more macro, lofty, philosophical stuff that I want to do, and I don't always stick the landing. So we'll see, we'll see where this goes. But what's interesting is if you've heard of like the idea of the great stagnation, it's kind of like Peter Thiel and others are really into this idea where it's basically like we got the supercomputer from Star Trek, but we just didn't get anything else. And as you were building your company, you got this amazing technology called the internet, right? But it seems like we haven't gotten a lot since then, right? We've gotten different interfaces. We've gotten the walled gardens. We've gotten the social media. We asked for flying cars. You got 140 characters. All those lines.
Yep.
What do you think that means for the next generation of CMOs, the people that are 30 something running these companies, or the people that are starting agencies now, or even your agency as you guys innovate and develop? To summarize my question, I guess, like how much juice do you think there is left to squeeze out of the internet?
Tons, everything. All the juice is in the internet. Like the fact that we're even talking about the internet. And this is a line from Michael Eisner that I read like 20 years ago. It's stuck in my mind, the old CEO of Disney, and I'm about to butcher it. But he was like, talking about the internet is like talking about telephone wires. Like it doesn't make any sense. It's just that's just how the information is transported. Everything is the internet going forward. Like think about our TVs. Most of us with discretionary income have a smart TV. We're getting a lot of OTT, whether it's Hulu or Netflix, the case may be. Everything is going to be interactive. Everything is going to be multimedia. We're probably at the point of diminishing returns in terms of major breakthroughs. We see a little augmented reality. It's fine. We see a little virtual reality right now. It's fine. But what's great about what we talk about, why we started our agency 20 years ago, everything that I've described and why we keep bringing on these huge clients is these aren't newfangled trendy ideas. This is a strategic platform that will last forever. In our industry of the internet, because it has been such a pronounced change, right? It's like dog years. Every internet year is equal to like 7 years. Like all these new trends come along. And, it's all about video. It's all about mobile. It's all about social. It's all about search. It's all about augmented reality. It's all about virtual reality. That's the way we talk as an industry. But that's not the truth. The truth of the matter is, when I close my eyes and I think about this industry, I see a big ampersand. It's about all of those things. It's about like, yes, because your audience is probably using all of those individual touch points and a whole mess of ones that we haven't even talked about yet today, like podcasts and audio and stuff that happens in store and things that happen in the car and the digital living room. You have to be in all those places and you have to show up in a meaningful way. And that's the point that we're getting at, is it's really two parts of the equation. One, create content that brings value to your audience. Two, put it in the right place in the consumer journey, period. That's the end of the equation, and that equation will last forever.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And it's kind of the same thing as, if you're at a crowded party and somebody says your name, you're more likely to hear it. If you are at a particular place in your customer journey and you want to buy a Mini Cooper and that ad hits you at the right time, it means something completely different to everybody else that's hitting it. And there's amazing utility there. So that's great. And I'm sure there's a lot more we can dig into, but to shift gears a little bit, I think that you have a really useful perspective to a lot of our listeners, because you've gotten so far and it's been 20 years, like you've talked about. I think there's a lot of talk and there's a lot of consultants and gurus that say there's this level off point, right? 0 to 1 million is this, 1 million to 2 million. You got to focus on these things. Kind of with some perspective, how do you think about it when you look back at the agency? Like, how do you think of the stages of growth of your agency and what you thought was important to focus on at those times? If that,
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, we talk about advertising, we talk about empowerment, we talk about the pain of interruptions. My dog's barking a little bit. Sorry about that.
no, it happened to me too. Yeah.
At the end of the day, if you're running any business, but in particular a small business, which is where I've spent my entire career, success is dictated by one thing and one thing only. It's culture. That's it. That's the most important learning. And I have, we've won agency of the year multiple times, and we've been on the verge of completely going out of business, right? I have been on the New York City subway platform, the most crowded yet anonymous place in the world, hands on my knees, tears gushing out of my eyes because I have felt the pain of mistakes that I have made. And from those mistakes and from those successes, culture is everything. Now, the issue is, what is culture really? Because when I started the business and I was in my 20s, I always knew culture was important. I just didn't know what it meant. So people would come up to me as we started to grow and be like, hey, man, the culture's a little off. And I'm like, oh, shit, that's not cool. I can fix that. Literally, I go straight to the stereo and I crank up the volume. And then that night we would go out and we'd party down and we go to the Russian Samovar in New York City and everyone get drunk. And the next day I triple down with another cool move. Everybody's got Egg McMuffins to absorb their hangover. And fucking everybody feels great. Like, dude, culture's awesome, man. You really care. We had a good time. We never had a yelling and screaming type of environment. It was always super positive. But then 3 days later, someone's like, dude, the culture's off. Like, what the fuck are you talking about? We just turned up the music. We just went drinking. I brought in the Egg McMuffins. Life is good. I thought culture comes down to one thing: putting people in position to do their best work. Period. Let me repeat it. Culture comes down to one thing: putting people in position to do their best work. Cranking up the music, going out and partying, getting Egg McMuffins on a hangover, that at best is icing on the cake. The cake, the core of it, is putting people in position to do their best work. If you hire the right people, that's all they want. They just want to do their best work. And the action items for that comes down to two things. It's talent acquisition and talent collaboration. Leaning into those. Talent acquisition. This is, 97% of the battle. Making sure that you've got incredible processes for bringing the right people in the door. I can't create culture. People think at our agency, if you ask them, dude, this is incredible culture. Like, you see it all the time. We didn't create that culture. We bring the culture in the front door by making sure we recruit the right people. We are specifically, our mission statement calls for us to bring in positive, creative people. Some people are negative and miserable, and I always thought I could turn those people. I can't offset whatever your mom and dad did to you growing up. I need naturally positive and naturally creative people who have the skills that match what we're looking for. Talent acquisition. That's most of the ballgame. The second half of it is talent collaboration. How do we get people to build synergies? That's the definition of a team. 1 + 1 is equal to more than 2, right? So what are the systems and what are the processes? It's not fun. Like, in my industry, advertising, it's creative. For a lot of your listeners, they work in creative industries. You work in a creative industry, Dan. Talking about processes for collaboration, investing in tools for collaboration, optimizing those processes and tools is not a lot of fun. But it's also not fun to know that you're working your ass off and it's dinner time and you got to keep working because there's no way to build synergies, because the world is way too complex for any individual to do it. Again, going way back to the start of the conversation where the industry used to be, and this is the same as many other industries, one extraordinarily talented person can get you by. One extraordinarily talented person in my industry could make or lead a team to make the most incredible 30-second spot, right? The Budweiser "What's Up" campaign, what's up? Like, that wasn't a team collaboration. Somebody had a crazy idea. They're like, fuck it, let's go develop this thing. And obviously a lot of people participated, but it was probably one guy who had a great idea. Now it's so much more complex. It's creativity, it's math, it's analytics, it's technology, it's project management. So what are the processes and tools that we have to get people to collaborate and break down those silos?
Yeah, I love that. And there's so much to get into there. Let's start with the biggest part of the pie from your description, which is talent acquisition. What have you learned about hiring over the years? Like how have your processes changed? How involved are you in it? I'd love to just look under the hood as much as you're willing to share with hiring
Yeah,
processes.
sure. Yeah, there's two massively important things I've learned. One of them is I suck at it. I suck at bringing on talent. And the reason for that, I had to realize what the root of the problem is. The root of the problem is I'm a people person. And not only am I a people person, I'm honestly like the face of the agency. Like now we've got a lot of amazing faces, but there has to be one person who's primarily in charge of how do you bring in new clients? How do you create new content? The way for me to do that is to be a people person. I don't have the luxury of zoning in or narrowing down on people's faults in this world. If I want to go work with an awesome company, I need to figure out what's great about the people at that company so that my team feels great about working with them. Now, the inverse is true when you're interviewing someone. You're not looking for simply what's great about them. You have to start looking for red flags, and you have to have a process to find those red flags. I'm terrible at it. So one of the things that we actually did is we had a woman on our team. Her name is Debbie Dumont. She got promoted over many years. Now she's the managing director. She leads the entire agency. She is absolutely incredible at everything. And she's in particular incredible at hiring people. So ultimately, I just got in the back seat. Like I will participate in the culture fit. Is this person a culture fit? But when you have to have a dramatic process to figure out, is that person really skilled at it? And then, there's a lot of documented ways of going about that. It's not my comfort zone. So let me get back in the back seat, right? If I had to do, I learned on day one, I'm also a shitty artist. Well, I'm not going to sit there and try to learn Photoshop. I'm going to figure out what my skills are. So learning that I was bad at it, promoting Debbie to run the agency was a massive part of the equation. The other massive part of the equation is there's a book called Who by Jeff Smart. I've had the privilege of spending some time with Jeff Smart. I wouldn't say he's a friend. I don't know him that well, but he helped with some content that we put in my first book, Friction. He's given me some guidance. More to the point, the book Who is absolutely fucking incredible. I've read hundreds and hundreds of business books. If I'm honest, I typically don't actually make it through, more than 2 or 3 chapters because so many books are not that great. Yours is, Dan. Who is unfucking believable. Unlike my books, where I tried to take some notes from Gladwell and make it really about storytelling. So each one of my chapters always starts with, here's the story, and then I hit to a pivot. So in my most recent book, on page 1, I cut my babysitter's thumb off because I'm an advertising guy. This really happened, and I somehow pivoted that into, here's some advertising lessons. Who is not like that? There's no real stories. For the most part, it's like, dude, step 1, step 2, step 3. When I was at my hands and knees on the subway platform crying my eyes out because I fucked up culture for a little while and didn't know what I was doing, that's when I got introduced to Who. That turned around my career. That turned around our industry, our agency. We've on a dramatic growth rate ever since. Go grab that book.
I love that because it really is about who's in the right seats more than anything else. And so much, it seems like so much of the other like ruminating and work we all do is really just about the wrong people being in the wrong places, and
Absolutely. Yeah.
which becomes hard to unstick, right? So that makes a lot of sense. And to go back to that, because like once I got to plug your book too. Once you're 2 pages in, you're not putting that book down. You open the book with nearly cutting off your babysitter's thumb. What did that teach you about risk? How are those things connected for those listening that haven't read it?
Yeah. Let me tell you the story, and then I'll tell you the learning in there. And we touched on it almost a little bit earlier, but I started the book with the earliest memory of my entire life. And my parents were out, and I'm in the kitchen with a 10-inch steak knife in my hand. It's one from the 70s. It was serrated, double points at the front, and it was literally designed for cutting the thickest hunks of meat. I'm in my my superhero pajamas, and I am absolutely hyperactive. And if you have kids, if you have like 6, 7, 8-year-olds, you know exactly what I'm talking about. There's a pivot point where kids will get to when they're up past their bedtime. And like when you're in college, it takes you massive amounts of drugs to get this level of happiness, right? You're just totally hyperactive. You're cackling your ass off. You're screaming with delight and laughter, except for the fact that I've got this steak knife in my hand and it's pointed right at my brother's torso. He doesn't know what to do. So we're standing right in front of the drawer, and he opens it up and he pulls out a 10-inch steak knife also. This is the more classic one that you see chefs get tattooed on their arm. It's not serrated. You see it in all the cooking shows. We've got it pointed right at each other's torsos. And I jab at him. He steps back. He jabs at me. I step back. I jab back at him. We're totally laughing our asses off with hyperactivity. And my babysitter is there. And he didn't know what to do. And he's a good dude. I like this guy. He didn't smell weird like my previous babysitter. And he's like, no. And I'm like, yes. And I'm like, no. He's like, no. And I'm like, yes. And finally, he's got to step in. What he should have done was grab my wrist. Instead, he goes for the blade. He clamps down on the blade at the same exact time that I pull it back. And the 10 inches of that blade that were designed to cut those thickest hunks of meat goes right through his thumb all the way down to the bone. Next thing you know, his thumb is like hanging off there. There's tons of blood. It's just pouring down his arm. It's dripping off his elbow, and there's a pool of it on the floor. We pick up the phone. We call 911. The ambulance comes, takes him away, and that's the end of this story. I remember everything. I remember the knife I had. I remember the knife my brother had. I remember the sound of the laughter. I remember where we were standing. I remember the pajamas. I remember the blood going drip, drip, drip onto the floor. But what I don't remember was this, the punishment, because there was no punishment. We bundled him up, stuck him in the ambulance. He went on his way, and the Rosenblum family never talked about this thing again. And the reason for that is my grandfather was a gangster. He used to beat the shit out of my father. Like, some of the stories are amazing. If you've ever seen Goodfellas, and there's that great scene where Henry Hill takes his date and they go through the Copacabana and they go through the side door, and it's a famous shot from Martin Scorsese, and it's a single camera, and he's going through and he's throwing tips at everybody, and then he's got a table right at the front of the Copacabana. That's how my father grew up when he was like 14. His gangster father would literally take him. He said the difference with this one is they didn't go through the side door. My grandfather was a Jewish gangster who worked in the liquor business, so we went right through the front door, same thing, table waiting for him. And there were all these other amazing stories, like my uncle, his uncle, Max, got hit with a hatchet. So he had this big crease across his forehead. Somehow he lived, and he would entertain all the kids at like Thanksgiving by taking the butt end of a lit cigarette, sticking in his forehead, and all the kids would laugh because he had a cigarette sticking out of his forehead. So these stories are amazing, except for one thing. My grandfather was a fucking monster. Like, you get past the fun gangster stories, he used to punch my father in the face. He used to kick my father in the face. My father tells a story about time moving in slow motion because at one point he felt his backside hit the ceiling. And his backside hit the ceiling because his own father picked him up, threw him through the air. And at that moment, time starts moving in slow motion when you realize it's a big fall to the floor. And what typically happens is when you are raised with such violence, it gets passed along to your kids. And grandfather beats your father, father beats. My father was incredible. He was like, no, the buck stops here. I literally had one of the greatest dads on planet Earth, still have one of the greatest dads on planet Earth. But his thing is like, I'm going to go in the exact opposite direction. So no matter what I did wrong, I would never get in trouble. Cut your babysitter's thumb off. Never even talked about it. And that's what went on. That's why I had the, terrible high school experience, terrible college experience, but it was the greatest gift ever. Because if you work in advertising, you have to start thinking differently. If you work in any industry, you have to start thinking differently, particularly over the past couple of decades. And I think for the next couple of decades, because we're in the middle of a revolution impacting every single industry around the world. And that revolution is, in the most simplistic form, it's about digital, right? Now, no longer are brands in charge and they can say whatever they want and you're going to believe it because there was a time where we passively listened to all those messages. Now the audience is in charge. They're going to look at the ratings. They're going to read the reviews. They're going to tell each other about it. They're going to do their own research. The power is now in their hands. And the greatest gift for me was to never get punished because now I can think of the world differently. And when I got into the world of advertising, which I fucking loved, but my thought wasn't to say, how can I make another 30-second spot that makes people laugh? My thought was, how do we create content that's meaningful and powerful?
Yeah, that's really great. And I love that you're kind of taking your own medicine by starting with something really compelling and memorable, and I think that there is a strong connection. Kind of getting towards the end of our time, Jeff, I think like I always like to end with the future, and where you kind of see things heading. So With that, where do you think the next stage of this revolution goes as it applies? Not the whole world, that's a huge question, but as it applies to you and Questus, and where do you think, where are you guys kind of thinking about taking risks over the next 1 to X years?
So, um, the short answer, culture. The answer will always be culture. How do we build our culture? Culture is what produces success for us. What happened is this idea that we had about empowering instead of interrupting people was absolutely the right call. And a handful of years ago, we won an Agency of the Year contest. And we actually didn't even fill out the form correctly. So our small agency went up against all these huge names, BBDO, Ogilvy, et cetera. We won Agency of the Year. Fucking awesome. Then the next year, we filled out the form correctly. We went against all the thousands of other great small agencies out there. We won it again. Hallelujah, because our platform was correct. What happened was we grew way too rapidly. And what we didn't understand was how to really build the culture that I've talked about, how to scale our own business. And that's what led to what I mentioned a couple times already, with me crying on the Subway platform, because we fucked things up, right? We broke our culture. People were unhappy. If my team is unhappy, I'm unhappy. The clients are unhappy. Thankfully, we turned it around really, really quickly. And what we learned about was culture. We built a new mission statement. That mission statement is build a place where positive, creative people can do their best work. I've mentioned the ingredients of that. Build a place where positive, creative people can do their best work. A mission statement is absolutely critical if you really think it through. And what we did is we said, what makes us happy? Because right now, with the blood and the snot and the tears all over our face, we're clearly not happy. Let's build a place filled with positive and creative people. Let's give them tools to do their best work. The problem with that is it works so extraordinarily well. We turned around like 2 years ago. We're like, holy shit, man, this is the best team of people I've ever been around in my life. Not only that, the best human beings I've ever been around. Like, the team that we have is so incredible. I can't take any credit because I already admitted that I'm terrible at fucking interviewing people. But, Debbie, and then she brought on other people, got really, really good at it. But then we're like, if we don't grow, how do we keep these people? Because if they're that good as marketers and advertisers, if they're that good as human beings, they're not sticking around unless we can give them their next amazing career opportunity. So we actually didn't have any plans to grow at all for a number of years when we fell on our faces, because we're like, let's just be a stable, happy business doing great work. And when we got to stable and happy and we're doing great work and we have these amazing clients, then we realized a couple of years ago, now we have to start to scale. And the mission, I think, that we have, not the mission, but the thing that we want to prove, and I'll always have a chip on my shoulder because I was a bad high school student, I was a bad college student, and nobody wanted to hire me coming out of college, and I'll wear that chip forever. It motivates me. Now I want to prove that we can have fun at scale, period. Like, everyone thinks that once you start scaling, once you start growing, that culture is going to break. You're going to turn into a cube farm. It's not going to be fun. Yeah, sure. That's absolutely true for tons and tons of companies around the world. For us, how can we have fun and do it at scale? And when I say fun, it's not just about going to the Russian Samovar and getting drunk and playing music. Again, that's nice. But what's fun is doing great work with people that you love. And we're going to do that at scale.
Yeah, that's awesome. It's such a great note to end on. And I'd love to get you back and talk more about that journey and what it takes to have fun at scale. But I love it because it's super tangible and it makes a lot of sense. And yeah, it definitely cuts against the status quo. So that's great, Jeff. And how can people follow Questus, kind of see what you're up to, get in touch, etc.?
Yeah, I would say the best way is check out our website at questus.com, Questus. You can find us on social at Questus Agency. Instagram's a big channel for us. I'm on Instagram at the Jeff Rosenblum. I don't actually do that much on there, so I wouldn't even bother with that. Check out Questus.com. Thanks for asking. I do appreciate it.
Yeah, likewise. And we'll definitely get the books linked up as well, which is Exponential and Friction was the previous one as well.
Yep, both up on Amazon. Exponential became a Wall Street Journal bestseller. For both of those, we're donating 100% of the profits to charity. So if you like it, do me a favor, leave a rating, leave a review, because it helps sell more books and turn into more donations.
That's great. Jeff, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Dan. I appreciate it.